Great. Welcome, everybody. This is a 20-minute session, fairly basic level, about query folding in Power Query with a focus on Power BI. A lot of what I say, probably all of what I say, is going to be relevant for Power Query and Excel, but all my demos are going to be in Power BI. I assume everybody's more interested in Power BI, Power Query. My name's Chris Webb. I work on the Power BI Customer Advisory team at Microsoft, and I love Power Query. It's my blog, my Twitter. Let's get on to the really important stuff. We've only got 20 minutes. So, a couple of really important questions that we're going to cover in this short session. First of all, what's query folding in Power Query and why is it important? Then we'll go on and have a look to know when query folding's happening in Power Query. Turns out to be more complicated than you would think. And then finally, we will look at some things that can stop query folding happening and look at what we can do to try and make them happen again. I'll take questions at the end. Even if there's no time, I'll be able to hang around and take questions. Okay, so first important question, what is query folding in Power Query? So Power Query we know is the part of Power BI that allows you to connect to your data sources, clean up the data, do all kinds of cool transformations before it gets loaded into your data set. The real question is, with all of these cool and useful transformations, where does the work actually get done? It can get done in two places. It can get done inside the Power Query engine, or the transformations can be pushed back to your data source, so they can be done before the data even gets to Power BI. This is what query folding is. It's the way the Power Query engine can try and push the transformations back to the data source. Doesn't happen for all data sources. Does for relational databases, for analysis services, for certain types of web services called OData web services. But it doesn't happen, for example, for CSV files or Excel. Why is this? Well, that's because when query folding takes place, Power Query has to have a way of pushing these transformations back to the source. So two things need to be present. The data source needs to have something like a query language, for example, SQL, but not necessarily SQL, that you can write, or that Power Query can write to express the transformations that it wants. And secondly, Power Query needs to know how to be able to speak that query language. It needs to be able to have a connector that can generate that query language to do those transformations. Neither of those exist, for example, with CSV files. A really common question is, well, what things can be pushed back with query folding? What transformations are possible for my particular source, for my particular query? The answer is, it's almost impossible to know. There's no documentation, and that's not because we're lazy at Microsoft, it's because it depends so much on so many different things. So, rather than try and look for some documentation, what you need to do is test your own queries and see what happens. And that's what I'm going to show you. The other important thing to understand is that if you think about a single Power Query query, which has got multiple transformations in, some of those transformations might be folded and some of them might not be. So it's not an all or nothing thing. Again, it depends. Next question, why is query folding important? Well, it's all about performance. Now, if you think about it, we already said Power Query can do the transformations in two places, either in its own engine or back in the data source. Query folding, when it happens, usually leads to better performance for two reasons. First of all, your source system is probably better at doing filters and transformations than the Power Query engine is, because it's a whopping great big relational database sitting on a high-powered server somewhere in a data center, rather than your rather rubbish laptop that hasn't been refreshed for 7 years. So, the data source has probably got more resources and is better tuned and is a nice enterprise grade something. The second is that even if you've got a brand spanking new amazing laptop and everything, if you think about it, your data source has got millions and millions of rows in a table. If it can do the transformations, Let's say I only want 5 out of those millions and millions of rows. It does the transformation, then it only needs to move those 5 rows over the wire. If the Power Query engine does the transformation, it needs to load all of those millions and millions of rows over the network to your PC to do the transformation. And again, that's going to take time and that's going to be inefficient. So doing the transformation close to the source when query folding happens is just going to be faster and more efficient. There are some rare cases where query folding makes performance worse. I have seen that, but they are super, super rare. So generally speaking, query folding is a very good thing, something we always want to happen. All right, now let's get on to the things where we've got lots and lots of demos. So we know what query folding is, we know why it's important, we know that we should try and do it wherever possible. The next question is, well, how do I know when query folding is happening? And this is one of those times where I, as a Microsoft person, say, well, we should probably do a better job. It's complicated, but it's also quite confusing for you, to the end user, to really know when query folding is happening, because there are so many other things that can happen that can confuse you. Now, I will tell you the ideal way to know when query folding is happening. What you should do to really, really know is, first of all, be able to see what's happening on your source system. Because if query folding's happening, the transformations are happening there, you should be able to see the transformations happening there, for example, by running a profiler trace or using extended events or something on SQL Server. So that's the first test. Check to see what's actually happening on the source. Now, in a lot of cases, you can't do that because you haven't got permissions, or maybe the source is inaccessible because it's somebody else's source. Second important thing, what do we really care about? Well, what we really care about is what happens when the dataset refreshes in the Power BI service. So that's what you should test. Other stuff may happen at other times, especially if you're working in Power BI Desktop. If you do a refresh in Power BI Desktop, some extra things quite often happen, and that can really confuse you. If you have a look and you kind of play around with things in the Power Query editor, again, extra stuff happens, extra things get sent to the data source, and that can be really, really confusing. So the ideal thing is check to see what happens when your refresh takes place in the Power BI service. All right, let's start to do some demos. I've got SQL Server running on my local machine, and I've got Power BI Desktop open. And if we have a look at my very first demo query here, it's called Basic Query Folding. What it does is it connects to the AdventureWorks database on my PC. We navigate to the dim date dimension table. Very, very boring, but everybody knows what a date dimension table looks like. And then I do 2 transformations. First of all, I'm doing a removed other columns, so I only get the columns that I want. And then I am filtering on the day name column, so I only get the days that are Saturdays. So nice, easy transformations to understand. How do I know if query folding's happening? Well, ideally, like I said, I'd publish the service. I don't like doing demos that have too much of a reliance on the internet, though. I will do one in a moment, but even in a good case here, I've loaded this to the dataset here, and I'm going to do a refresh. But before I do a refresh, look, I've got a profiler trace running against the SQL Server database, and I'm going to do a refresh data. It's loaded the data nice and quickly. And here, the very last SQL query that's been run is this. And you can see that the select statement that's been generated only has the columns that I asked for in the Power Query query. And look, it's got a where clause where English day name of week equals Saturday. So those 2 transformations I did in my Power Query query have been folded. I can see they've been turned into the SQL query that we see here. And luckily in this case, in Power BI Desktop, There aren't, well, there are some other things happening to get metadata, but there are no other select statements, so nice and easy. Depending on your source, though, in Power BI Desktop, you might see some other queries, other select statements that are there specifically to get metadata. They might say top 1000 or top 4096 or limit 0 or something. You know, you can ignore those because that's just the analysis services engine running some queries to try and get metadata from the queries that you're running. But here, it works really nicely. So this is what you'd see if you'd done the refresh in the Power BI service as well. Now, the confusing thing is that there are other ways to see whether query folding is happening. Let's have a look at those. Now, the thing that particularly confuses people is that there are a lot of blog posts and documentation out there talking about this feature here. So here's my applied steps pane as my last step in the query. I can right-click on this step, and there is this View Native Query option here. Now, in this case, it's enabled. I can click on it, and look, there's the SQL statement we saw earlier. When View Native Query is enabled, you can be sure that query folding is taking place, because look, it'll show you the query that's being run. The confusing thing is that when it is not enabled, query folding may still be taking place. So, the fact it's enabled is good, and I know for a SQL Server database, when it's enabled, query folding is taking place. When it's not enabled, it's not taking place. But let's have a look at another source. So I mentioned earlier that there are these web services called OData web services. OData is a web standard built by Microsoft. It's a standard for web services. It supports kind of certain SQL-y type operations like filtering on a table. And in this case, I've connected to a public OData demo source called TripPin, and I'm connecting to a table called people. So here we are, there's people with a first name and a last name, and I've got a query here that, again, does a filter, and it's just giving me all the people whose first name is Angel. And if I right-click on this, View Native Query is not happening. But I know in this case that it is happening, because I happen to know the insides of this. I prepared this demo. How could I work this out? Well, I could run Fiddler, for example, and have a look at the traffic, which is a bit of a pain. Luckily, in Power BI Desktop in the Power Query Editor, there is something else we can do. You can right-click on a step, and in this case, it's going to be important to right-click on the last step of the query, because that's the final output, and you can do this diagnose thing here. This opens up the Power Query query diagnostics that are only available in Power BI Desktop. But if I right-click and diagnose this, it's going to capture traffic. Did I click that? There we go. And it's going to create some log files on my local PC, and it's create some Power Query queries that connect to those log files. There's all kinds of things happen with performance counters, but I'm connecting to the detailed one, which contains all the detailed information. And this is always guaranteed to give me somewhere the query that goes back to the data source, whatever the source is. And if I have a look at this, there will be somewhere in here, actually if I go down to the bottom, there will be one, something that does specifically say give me the filter on Angel. Somewhere here, I promise. Oh, actually, I'm looking in the wrong column, that's why. There we go. And if we have a look here, you can see there is the filter query thing on Angel. It's only getting the top 1,000 because the Power Query editor will always apply a top 1,000 filter as well. You can see it's immensely fiddly, but it gives you the answer you want. I can see the filter is being passed back to the source. Something else worth mentioning is that if you're using data flows and you're using Power Query Online, there are some cool, useful things in Power Query Online that you can do here called step folding indicators. So if you're doing the same transformation, you've got some options here that can actually show you what's going on. So for example, if I was to filter here on Angel, it's going to give me this little icon here that says, well, maybe query folding is taking place. And I can also then go to View Query Plan. And it's unsure about whether query folding is taking place, but it says, well, one of these two things is going to happen. Either it's going to get all of the data and do the transformation inside, or it's going to actually do the filtering itself. And if we look at this one where the filtering's happening, there's that same URL that says, give me Angel. Okay. Last thing. What about times when things can't be folded? So there are a whole bunch of transformations that for whatever reason can't be folded to the data source, either because Power Query doesn't know how to do it or the data source doesn't support it. A really good example tends to be adding an index column for whatever reason. And I know, going against SQL Server, that adding an index column will stop query folding taking place. Let's see some examples of where that happens. So if I go back to here, and we have a look at this. Here is my query where I've removed other columns that I don't want, but in this case, I am adding an index column, which is basically a row number. And if I right-click on this, View Native Query is grayed out. And I know in this case, because it's SQL Server, all it's doing is it's going to generate a SQL query. We should be able to do that nice and easily. If I refresh the preview here, it's going to get me a query that only includes the columns that I want. There we go. But it's not doing anything with adding the index column because it just can't do it. The connector doesn't know how to do it. Doing the transformation in a different way can sometimes allow you to get folding to happen. Let's see an example of this. I've got a different table from AdventureWorks here, the product categories table. It's really basic. It's got 4 rows with numbers on. These are the 4 product categories in AdventureWorks. And it's got an integer key. What I want to do is a Cartesian product. I want to join this table to itself and get all the possible combinations. Now, one way of doing this is to add a custom column and then say, let's nest that table product categories in each one, and then do an expand. That works. That's the easy, obvious way, but it doesn't fold. Instead, what you can do is something different. So here what I've done is added a custom column that always contains the value 1, joined the table onto itself, done an expand, and removed the columns I don't want. And what it's done here is it knows how to add that custom column that always contains 1 to SQL, knows how to do a join a table onto itself in SQL, and it's generated an inner join onto the table. On 1, we get exactly the same result. Other things we can do, for example, if we change the order, sometimes that dictates whether query folding happens. So I've got a query here that does what I did before, takes these columns, adds an index column, and then adds a year. So it takes that date and extracts the year. And if I right-click, View Native Query is grayed out. Turns out that if I insert the year column first and then add the index column, that is not folded. The index column is never folded, but the key thing is the year will be folded. So sometimes changing the order of the operations will force folding to happen. One final thing to mention. A lot of people love to write native SQL when they connect, like select star from dim date. If you do a filter on that with the SQL Server connector, query folding doesn't happen. what you need to do instead with a SQL Server connector, this happens natively with some other connectors like Snowflake, where here I'm using the value.native query function with this special extra parameter called enable folding equals true. That allows me to enter a native SQL query and then do a filter, and that will get folded. So there's a lot of it depends. Maybe the very last thing to show really quickly, because I've run out of time, is if you want query folding to stop, there is actually a function you can add manually called table.stopFolding, which will prevent all query folding happening after that point. One more demo I didn't have time for, data privacy. I've got recorded presentations on data privacy, but that can also have an effect on query folding. Hopefully you've learned something, and I am available to take questions at the end. There's the feedback link. Thank you very much.